You think you can just waltz through here in that raggedy hoodie and sit in first class? Not on my watch, princess. Those words would come back to haunt Trevor Hawkins in ways he never imagined, because the woman standing in front of him wasn't just another passenger trying to game the airline industry. She was about to become his worst nightmare, and by the time this story ends, he'll wish he'd never gotten out of bed that morning. The early morning light filtering through the massive windows of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport felt different today, sharper somehow, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Zara Williams adjusted the hood of her faded University of Texas sweatshirt, the fabric worn soft from years of wear during her graduate school days, when every penny mattered and designer clothes were nothing more than magazine fantasies. She carried a beat-up canvas messenger bag that had seen better days, probably around the time she was working double shifts as a ground crew member to pay for her aviation management courses, and her sneakers had that particular kind of scuffed authenticity that only came from real wear, not the expensive, distressed look that celebrities paid thousands for. At 31, Zara Williams had just been named CEO of SkyBridge Airlines, making her the youngest African-American woman to ever lead a major carrier in the United States. But looking at her now, shuffling through the terminal like any other tired traveler, you'd never guess she had the power to ground entire fleets with a single phone call. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to board one of her own planes, surrounded by employees who had no idea they were serving their boss, and the thought both excited and terrified her in ways she hadn't expected. The board of directors had been skeptical from day one, their doubt hanging in the air during every meeting like expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the underlying stench of their prejudice. They'd whispered about diversity hires and affirmative action behind closed doors, never quite brave enough to say it to her face, but loud enough for her to hear through the thin walls of corporate politics. Her appointment had come after the previous CEO's spectacular failure, a mess so catastrophic that even the old boys network couldn't protect him from the fallout. And now here she was, expected to clean up decades of mismanagement, while simultaneously proving she belonged in a world that had never wanted women like her. Customer satisfaction scores for SkyBridge had been plummeting for months, with complaints ranging from rude staff interactions to what passengers described as deliberately discriminatory treatment. And while the reports painted a concerning picture, Zara knew that numbers on spreadsheets could never capture the full reality of what people experienced when they traveled. She needed to feel it herself to understand exactly how her employees treated customers when they thought no one important was watching, because she'd learned long ago that the truth about any organization could be found not in its mission statements or training manuals, but in the small moments when people thought their actions wouldn't have consequences. Her father had taught her that lesson during the countless hours she'd spent in aircraft hangars as a child, watching him work on engines with the kind of precision that came from understanding that every bolt, every wire, every seemingly insignificant component could mean the difference between a safe flight and a catastrophe. "Pay attention to the little things, baby girl," he used to say while she handed him tools, her small fingers barely able to grip the heavy wrenches, because the little things always tell you everything you need to know about the big picture. Now, walking through her own airline's terminal, she was paying attention to everything, and what she was seeing made her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and determination that tasted like cold metal in her mouth. The check-in area was a study in controlled chaos, with passengers lined up like cattle while understaffed counters moved at a pace that suggested the employees were being paid by the hour, rather than motivated by any desire to actually help people reach their destinations. And she could already feel the weight of the problems she'd inherited settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd chosen this particular route, Dallas to London, because the complaints had been especially brutal on international flights, with passengers describing treatment that ranged from dismissive to downright hostile, and she wanted to experience the entire journey from the perspective of someone who didn't have executive privileges or VIP treatment to smooth over the rough edges. The first-class ticket in her bag had cost more than many people made in a month, but she'd paid for it with her personal credit card rather than using company funds, partly to maintain the illusion, but mostly because she wanted to feel the full financial impact of what she was asking customers to pay for. As she approached the SkyBridge check-in counter, she could already see the problem playing out in real time, and it made her heart sink with the realization that fixing this company was going to be even harder than she'd imagined. The check-in counter area buzzed with the kind of barely controlled frustration that seemed to be the natural atmosphere of modern air travel. But as Zara observed the interactions between her employees and customers, she began to understand that what she was witnessing wasn't just the normal stress of a busy airport. It was something far more troubling and deliberate. The SkyBridge agents moved with a particular kind of mechanical indifference, their smiles plastic and their helpfulness seemingly rationed like wartime supplies, and she watched with growing alarm as they demonstrated exactly why her airline's reputation had been circling the drain. Patricia Reeves, according to her name tag, was handling the economy class line with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. Her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her keyboard in a staccato rhythm that somehow managed to convey both boredom and irritation simultaneously. When a young mother approached her counter, struggling to balance a crying infant on her hip while dragging an overstuffed diaper bag and a wheeled suitcase that seemed determined to tip over at the worst possible moment, Zara expected to see at least a flicker of human compassion cross the agent's face. Instead, she watched Patricia's expression harden into something that resembled barely tolerated annoyance, as if the woman's obvious distress was nothing more than an inconvenience designed to make her day more difficult. "Boarding passes and ID," Patricia demanded without looking up from her screen, her tone suggesting that pleasantries were a luxury she couldn't afford to waste on economy passengers. The young mother, who couldn't have been more than 25 and looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks, fumbled through her purse with one hand while trying to keep her baby from arching his back and sliding out of her grip, and Zara could see the panic starting to creep into her movements as she realized that what should have been a simple transaction was turning into a humiliating ordeal. "I'm sorry, I just need a second," the mother said, her voice shaky with exhaustion and embarrassment. "He's been crying for the past hour, and I think he's hungry, and I can't seem to find—" "Ma'am," Patricia interrupted with the kind of exaggerated patience that was somehow more insulting than outright rudeness. "There's a line behind you, and I have a schedule to maintain. If you're not ready to check in, you'll need to step aside and get organized before approaching the counter." The baby's cries intensified as if he could sense his mother's stress, and Zara watched the woman's face crumple slightly as she struggled to maintain her composure while dealing with what should have been routine customer service. Behind her, other passengers were beginning to shift impatiently, some checking their watches with theatrical exaggeration, others muttering under their breath about delays and incompetence, and the atmosphere was becoming thick with the kind of collective irritation that could turn ugly quickly. "Please," the mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now, I just need help with the car seat check. The website said you could help me with the gate check process, and I've never flown with a baby before, and I don't understand." Patricia's sigh was audible from 10 feet away, and she made a show of looking at her computer screen as if the answer to world hunger might be hidden somewhere in the check-in system. "The car seat instructions are on the website," she said without bothering to make eye contact, "and if you need special assistance, you should have requested it when you booked your ticket. I can't hold up the entire line because you didn't prepare properly." Zara felt her hands clench into fists inside her hoodie pockets, and she had to actively remind herself that she was here to observe, not to intervene, even though every instinct she had was screaming at her to step forward and demand that Patricia treat this woman with the basic human decency that should have been the absolute minimum standard for customer service. Instead, she forced herself to stay in character, to be just another passenger watching this drama unfold. and she made mental notes about the complete breakdown in training and compassion that was happening right in front of her. The situation escalated when the baby's crying reached a pitch that seemed to cut through every conversation in the immediate area, and Patricia's facade of professional patience finally cracked completely. "Ma'am, you're going to need to get that baby under control," she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw stares from across the terminal. "This is a public space, and other customers have a right to conduct their business without that noise." The young mother's face flushed red with humiliation, and something that looked dangerously close to rage, and for a moment Zara thought she might actually tell Patricia exactly where she could shove her customer service attitude, but instead she just gathered her baby closer to her chest and whispered something that might have been an apology. The sight of this exhausted woman apologizing for her infant's completely normal behavior while dealing with an employee who had clearly never been taught that empathy was part of her job description made Zara's blood pressure spike in ways that probably weren't healthy. When a supervisor finally appeared, summoned by Patricia's increasingly dramatic gestures and complaints about difficult passengers, Zara watched with grim fascination as the situation somehow managed to get even worse. Instead of offering assistance or attempting to de-escalate the tension, the supervisor immediately took Patricia's side, suggesting that perhaps the woman should consider rebooking her flight for a time when she could better manage her child's needs, as if flying with an infant was some kind of optional luxury rather than a sometimes unavoidable necessity of modern life. As Zara finally stepped forward to join the check-in line herself, she carried with her a growing sense of dread about what else she might discover during this journey. Because if this was how her employees treated customers in full view of dozens of witnesses, she could only imagine what happened in the more private moments of air travel, where accountability was even more limited. The TSA checkpoint at Dallas-Fort Worth felt like entering a different country, one where the rules were arbitrary, the authorities absolute, and the presumption of innocence was a luxury that had to be earned rather than a right that was guaranteed. And as Zara approached the security screening area, she could feel the atmosphere shift from the chaotic but manageable stress of the check-in process to something far more ominous and unpredictable. The blue-shirted agents moved with the kind of swagger that came from wielding unchecked power over vulnerable people, and she watched with growing unease as they demonstrated exactly how a little authority could corrupt someone who had never learned the difference between security and intimidation. Trevor Hawkins stood at the document-checking station like a guard dog that had been trained to bite first and ask questions later, his thick neck bulging over the collar of his uniform in a way that suggested he spent more time at the gym building muscle than he did at home. Reading policy manuals, and there was something in his eyes when he looked at passengers that reminded Zara of predators she'd seen in nature documentaries, the kind that picked out the weakest members of the herd, for reasons that had nothing to do with actual threat assessment. At 45, Hawkins had been working airport security for 12 years, long enough to develop the kind of cynical worldview that saw every passenger as a potential criminal and every interaction as an opportunity to demonstrate who was really in control, and his recent divorce had left him bitter and angry in ways that he was clearly taking out on people who had no choice but to submit to his authority. His supervisor had already received multiple complaints about his aggressive tactics and discriminatory behavior, but the post-9/11 security culture had created an environment where being too harsh was rarely seen as worse than being too lenient. And Hawkins had learned to exploit that atmosphere with the skill of someone who understood exactly how far he could push before facing any real consequences. Zara watched him work for several minutes before joining his line, and what she saw made her stomach turn with a combination of disgust and professional outrage that threatened to blow her cover before she'd even presented her identification. Hawkins had a pattern, she realized, a methodology to his cruelty that was as predictable as it was despicable, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting passengers who looked like they might not have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. An elderly man with a thick accent had been pulled aside for additional screening that seemed to involve far more humiliation than security, with Hawkins speaking to him in the kind of loud, slow voice that people used when talking to children or pets. Even though the man's English was perfectly clear and his confusion was obviously related to the confusing nature of the security procedures rather than any language barrier. "Sir, I need you to understand that when I give you an instruction, you need to follow it immediately." Hawkins barked while unpacking every item from the man's carefully packed suitcase. "And if you don't understand English well enough to travel, maybe you should consider staying home next time." The casual racism in his tone was so blatant that Zara actually looked around to see if any of the other agents were going to intervene, but they all seemed to be conveniently focused on their own tasks, their studied indifference suggesting that this was exactly the kind of behavior that had been normalized through years of looking the other way. The elderly man's face burned with shame as Hawkins held up each item from his luggage, as if it might contain explosives, commenting loudly about suspicious items that were clearly just personal belongings, and by the time the screening was finished, the man looked like he'd been through an interrogation rather than a security check. When a teenager with green hair and multiple piercings approached the checkpoint, Hawkins's eyes lit up with the kind of predatory enthusiasm that made Zara's skin crawl, and she watched him manufacture reasons to subject the kid to additional screening that seemed designed more to teach a lesson about conformity than to address any legitimate security concerns. "Bag check," Hawkins announced with obvious satisfaction, "and I want everything emptied out where I can see it, because kids who dress like that are usually hiding something they shouldn't be carrying." The teenager's face flushed with embarrassment as other passengers stared and whispered, but he complied with the demands with a resigned acceptance that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with authority figures who had decided his appearance made him automatically suspicious. Hawkins took his time going through the bag, holding up items like art supplies and band merchandise as if they were evidence of criminal intent, and his running commentary was clearly designed to humiliate rather than to ensure security. What made the display even more disturbing was the way other passengers reacted to it, some nodding in approval, as if aggressive treatment of anyone who looked different was not only acceptable but necessary, while others simply looked away with the kind of willful blindness that allowed injustice to flourish in plain sight. The culture of fear that had been cultivated around air travel had created an environment where excessive authority was not only tolerated but expected, and people like Hawkins had learned to exploit that fear with the efficiency of someone who understood that scared people rarely stood up for themselves or others. As Zara's turn approached, she could feel Hawkins's attention focusing on her with laser-like intensity, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a way that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. And she realized that everything about her appearance, from her worn clothing to her casual demeanor, had already marked her as someone worth targeting. The first-class boarding pass in her hand might as well have been a red flag waved in front of a bull because someone like her wasn't supposed to have access to that kind of luxury, and she could practically see the gears turning in Hawkins's head as he prepared to demonstrate exactly what happened to people who tried to rise above their perceived station in life. Next, he barked, though she was already stepping forward, and the tone of his voice carried a challenge that had nothing to do with security protocols and everything to do with the kind of power trip that turned ordinary people into petty tyrants who thrived on making others feel small and helpless. The moment Zara handed Trevor Hawkins her boarding pass and passport, she could see his demeanor shift from routine indifference to something much more dangerous. A predatory focus that made the air around them feel charged with the kind of electricity that preceded lightning strikes, and she knew with absolute certainty that what was about to happen had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns, and everything to do with a man who had decided that someone like her had no business sitting in first class. Hawkins held her boarding pass up to the light with theatrical suspicion, his thick fingers turning the paper over and over as if he expected to find evidence of forgery hidden in the airline's standard printing, and his expression was a masterclass in manufactured doubt designed to make her feel like a criminal who had been caught in the act of some elaborate fraud. SkyBridge Flight 447 to London. He read aloud, his voice dripping with the kind of skepticism that was meant to be overheard by the growing line of passengers behind her first-class seat 2A. The way he said first class made it sound like an obscenity, as if the very concept of her occupying premium seating was so absurd that it required special emphasis, and Zara could feel the weight of other travelers' eyes on her back as they began to tune into what was obviously going to be some kind of confrontation. She maintained her composure with the discipline that had been drilled into her through years of navigating hostile boardrooms and skeptical investors, but inside she was making careful mental notes about every aspect of this interaction for the comprehensive report she was already planning to write. "Is there a problem with my ticket, officer?" she asked in the kind of calm, professional tone that had served her well in countless difficult situations. But she could see immediately that her composed response had only irritated Hawkins further, as if her refusal to be intimidated was somehow proof of guilt rather than evidence of innocence. Hawkins set the boarding pass down on his podium with deliberate force and picked up her passport, flipping it open to her photo page with movements that were unnecessarily rough, clearly designed to demonstrate his power over both her documents and her person. "This seat costs about $15,000. One way," he said, leaning forward across the podium so that his face was uncomfortably close to hers, his breath carrying the stale smell of coffee and something that might have been onions. "And I'm supposed to believe that you just casually dropped that kind of money for a transatlantic flight." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, thick and choking and impossible to ignore, and Zara could hear murmurs starting up behind her as other passengers began to speculate about what kind of crime she might have committed to afford such luxury. The psychology of the moment was expertly crafted to make her feel isolated and vulnerable, surrounded by strangers who were being primed to see her as suspicious, and she realized that Hawkins had probably perfected this technique through years of practice on travelers who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. "I don't think my personal finances are subject to TSA review," she replied, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was beginning to race with a combination of anger and adrenaline that made her hands want to shake. "And I'm not sure what authority you have to question how I choose to spend my money." The response clearly wasn't what Hawkins had expected, and his eyes narrowed with the kind of focused malice that suggested he was preparing to escalate this confrontation to a level that would make her regret challenging his authority. Behind her, she could hear someone mutter something about entitled attitudes and people who don't know their place, and she realized that the crowd was beginning to turn against her exactly as Hawkins had intended. "Everything is subject to my review." Hawkins snapped, his voice rising loud enough to carry across the checkpoint area and draw the attention of agents at other stations. "And right now, I'm seeing a lot of red flags that suggest you might not be traveling with legitimate documentation or legitimate funds." He gestured to her appearance with obvious disdain, taking in her faded hoodie and worn sneakers as if they were evidence of criminal behavior. "Random additional screening," he announced, pointing to a cordoned-off area with a metal table that looked like it had been designed specifically for humiliation purposes. The words "random additional screening" were clearly anything but random, and Zara knew that what was about to happen was a deliberate attempt to break down her dignity and force her into submission through public embarrassment, but she also understood that any resistance on her part would only be used as further justification for whatever treatment Hawkins had planned. As she walked toward the designated area, she could feel dozens of eyes following her movement, and she heard whispered conversations that ranged from sympathy to suspicion, with most people seeming to default to the assumption that airport security must have legitimate reasons for their actions. Riley Chen, a young TSA agent who looked like she couldn't be much older than 24, was standing near the additional screening area with an expression that suggested she was deeply uncomfortable with what she was witnessing, but her body language made it clear that she wasn't about to challenge a senior colleague's decisions, regardless of her personal feelings about the situation. When Zara made eye contact with her, she saw a flicker of something that might have been sympathy or recognition, but it disappeared quickly as Riley turned her attention back to her clipboard, with the studied neutrality of someone who had learned that keeping your head down was safer than speaking up. Hawkins followed Zara to the metal table with the confident stride of someone who was completely certain that he was untouchable, and as he began barking instructions about placing her belongings on the surface for inspection, she realized that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, because the woman he thought he was humiliating was actually the one person in the entire airport system who had the power to end his employment with a single phone call. The irony of the situation might have been funny if it wasn't so deeply disturbing, but as Hawkins began his aggressive search of her personal belongings, treating each item like potential evidence in a criminal case, Zara focused on maintaining her cover while documenting every detail of what was happening for the reckoning that was inevitably coming. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed by legal experts, and cited in congressional hearings about abuse of power in federal agencies. But in the moment it was happening, it felt to Zara like watching her own dignity being systematically destroyed by someone who had confused authority with license to dehumanize anyone he deemed unworthy of respect. Hawkins dumped the contents of her messenger bag onto the metal table with unnecessary force, sending her laptop sliding dangerously close to the edge, while her personal belongings scattered across the surface like evidence at a crime scene, and his hands moved through her possessions with a roughness that seemed designed to demonstrate his complete disregard for both her property and her privacy. He held up her Harvard MBA diploma case, as if it were a piece of suspicious contraband, turning it over in his hands, while making exaggerated expressions of doubt that were clearly performed for the benefit of the growing crowd of onlookers. "Fancy diploma," he said with a sneer that made the achievement sound like something shameful rather than the result of years of hard work and sacrifice. "I suppose you're going to tell me you earned this legitimately, too." The way he said legitimately carried implications that made several people in the crowd nod knowingly, as if they had been expecting exactly this kind of revelation about someone who had obviously been living above her means through questionable methods. Zara watched him handle the symbol of everything she had worked for with the same casual disrespect he might show to a piece of garbage, and she felt something cold and dangerous begin to crystallize in her chest, a fury so pure and focused that it almost scared her with its intensity. "That diploma represents 4 years of graduate study in aviation management and crisis resolution," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to let him know that his intimidation tactics were beginning to have the opposite of their intended effect. "And I'm not sure why you think educational achievements are relevant to airport security." The response seemed to enrage Hawkins further, as if her refusal to be properly humiliated was a personal insult that required immediate correction, and he moved from her diploma to her laptop with movements that were clearly intended to be as threatening as possible. "Nice computer," he said, running his fingers along the expensive aluminum casing in a way that made her skin crawl. "I bet someone like you couldn't afford something like this through honest work." The casual assumption of criminality in his tone was so blatant that it drew gasps from some of the watching passengers, but others seemed to nod in agreement, their expressions suggesting that they, too, found it suspicious that someone dressed like she was could possess expensive electronics, and Zara realized that Hawkins was successfully manipulating the crowd's prejudices to build support for whatever he planned to do next. When he picked up her passport again, holding it by the corner like it was contaminated with something contagious, she felt her heart rate spike with a premonition that something truly terrible was about to happen, because there was something in his eyes that went beyond mere power tripping into territory that felt genuinely dangerous. "This passport," he announced, loudly enough for half the terminal to hear, "shows clear signs of tampering. The lie was so outrageous that for a moment Zara couldn't quite process what she was hearing because her passport was less than 2 years old, issued by the State Department with all the security features intact, and there was absolutely nothing about it that could legitimately be called suspicious. But Hawkins was holding it up for the crowd to see, pointing to non-existent irregularities with the confidence of someone who knew that most people would believe official authority over their own observations, and she watched in horror as several passengers began nodding along with his fabricated assessment. "Officer Hawkins," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had silenced hostile boardrooms full of skeptical executives, "that is a legitimate United States passport, issued by the Department of State. And if you're suggesting otherwise, I demand to speak with your supervisor immediately." But instead of being intimidated by her tone, Hawkins seemed energized by what he clearly saw as confirmation that he was dealing with someone who thought she was better than him, someone who needed to be taught exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of airport power structures. "I am the supervisor on this checkpoint." He lied smoothly, though everyone present could see the actual supervisor's name clearly displayed on the board behind him, and I determine what constitutes suspicious documentation. Riley Chin took a step forward. Her young face creased with obvious distress as she watched the situation spiral beyond anything that could be justified by legitimate security concerns. But when Hawkins shot her a look that promised career-ending consequences if she interfered, she stepped back with the defeated expression of someone who had learned that moral courage often came with professional costs that not everyone could afford to pay. "This passport," Hawkins continued, his voice rising to ensure maximum public humiliation, "is clearly fraudulent, and federal law requires me to confiscate and destroy any suspicious documents to prevent their use in further criminal activity." The words were complete fabrications, a twisted interpretation of regulations that bore no resemblance to actual TSA protocol, but they were delivered with such official-sounding authority that most of the watching crowd accepted them as legitimate procedure. Zara felt the world slow down around her as she realized what was about to happen, and she made one last desperate attempt to prevent the disaster that was unfolding before her eyes. "If you destroy my passport," she said, her voice carrying a warning that would have made anyone who knew her identity immediately back down, "you will regret it for the rest of your life." Hawkins paused for just a moment, seeming to consider whether there might be something he was missing. But then his face hardened with the stubborn determination of someone who had gone too far to turn back now, and he gripped her passport with both hands like he was preparing to break a piece of firewood. "Is that a threat?" he shouted, making sure everyone could hear his interpretation of her words. "Are you threatening a federal officer in the performance of his duties?" And then with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire terminal like a gunshot, he tore her passport completely in half, the blue cover separating from the identification pages with a violence that felt personal and deliberate. And as the pieces fell onto the metal table, like the remains of something that had been murdered, Zara understood that everything was about to change in ways that Trevor Hawkins could never have imagined. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of someone in the crowd whispering, "Oh my God," and the distant hum of jet engines that suddenly seemed to be coming from another world entirely, because in this moment, in this space, there was nothing but the torn remains of federal property and the shocked faces of people who had just witnessed something that crossed every line of acceptable behavior, even in an airport environment where excessive authority had become normalized. Hawkins stood there holding the pieces of her passport with an expression of triumph that suggested he believed he had just won some kind of victory. But Zara was already reaching for her phone with the calm certainty of someone who was about to unleash consequences that would make his previous displays of power look like child's games in comparison. The phone call that would end Trevor Hawkins' career lasted exactly 37 seconds. But in that brief span of time, the entire power structure of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport shifted so dramatically that witnesses would later describe it as watching the Earth reverse its rotation. And as Zara spoke into her phone with the kind of calm authority that came from owning the very airline that Hawkins thought he was protecting, she could see his expression begin to change from triumph to confusion to something approaching terror. "James, this is Zara Williams," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the checkpoint area as she made no effort to lower her tone or conceal her words from the crowd that had gathered to watch what they assumed would be her arrest and humiliation. "I'm at the TSA checkpoint in Terminal C, and I need you to bring airport police and the SkyBridge station manager immediately. A federal officer has just destroyed my passport, and I want him arrested before I board my flight to London." The name Zara Williams didn't immediately register with most of the watching passengers, but Riley Chen's face went white with recognition, and several of the other TSA agents who had been pretending not to pay attention suddenly snapped to attention with the kind of focused awareness that suggested they were beginning to understand that something very significant was happening. Hawkins, however, was still operating under the assumption that this was some kind of elaborate bluff designed to intimidate him into backing down from his legitimate exercise of authority. "Put the phone away," he barked with the same aggressive confidence he had been displaying throughout the encounter, reaching toward her as if he intended to physically confiscate her device. "You're under arrest for threatening a federal officer and attempting to use fraudulent documentation, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But before he could complete whatever misguided arrest procedure he thought he was initiating, the atmosphere of the entire checkpoint began to shift as word spread through the terminal staff network that something unprecedented was happening. And within minutes, the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps echoed through the concourse as a group of people moved toward them with the kind of urgency that suggested this was no ordinary passenger dispute. James Rodriguez, chief of security for SkyBridge Airlines, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and then taught to wear expensive suits. And when he appeared at the checkpoint, flanked by 2 airport police officers and Lisa Park, the SkyBridge station manager, his expression was so grim that even passengers who had been supporting Hawkins began to sense that perhaps they had misjudged the situation. Rodriguez moved through the security area with the kind of authority that came from decades in law enforcement and corporate security, and his eyes locked onto Zara's face with relief so obvious that it was visible from across the room. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carrying the weight of professional respect and personal concern. "Are you injured?" The way he addressed her with the kind of deference that was reserved for people at the very top of corporate hierarchies sent a wave of confused murmuring through the crowd of onlookers, and Hawkins's face began to show the first signs of genuine uncertainty as he started to process the implications of what he was witnessing. "I'm fine, James," Zara replied, her composure never wavering, even though she was standing in the middle of an airport checkpoint with tomato juice stains on her hoodie and her personal belongings scattered across a metal table like crime scene evidence. But Officer Hawkins here seems to believe that destroying federal property is within his authority, and I'd like him to explain that belief to the appropriate legal authorities. Rodriguez turned his attention to Hawkins with the kind of focused intensity that made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years dealing with security threats far more dangerous than petty bureaucrats with power complexes. "Officer, did you destroy this woman's passport?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to single combat, and Hawkins's response demonstrated exactly how thoroughly he had misread the situation and miscalculated his position in the hierarchy of airport authority. "She presented fraudulent documentation," he said, his voice beginning to show signs of stress as the certainty that had carried him through the encounter started to crack, and federal regulations require immediate confiscation and destruction of suspicious materials to prevent their use in additional criminal activities. Lisa Park, who had been watching the interaction with the horrified expression of someone watching a career-ending disaster unfold in real time, stepped forward with her tablet already open to employee records and security protocols, and her voice shook slightly as she delivered information that would transform Hawkins from predator to prey in the span of a single sentence. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her professional training warring with obvious panic. "I need to inform you that Officer Hawkins has just destroyed the passport of Zara Williams, Chief Executive Officer of SkyBridge Airlines." The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that it felt like the entire airport had stopped breathing, and even the ambient noise of jet engines and terminal announcements seemed to fade into background whispers as the full implications of what had just been revealed settled over the checkpoint like a toxic cloud that contaminated everything it touched. Hawkins's face went through a series of color changes that might have been comical under different circumstances, shifting from confident red to confused, pale, to the kind of gray-green that suggested his digestive system was beginning to rebel against the stress of his situation, and his mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound as his brain struggled to process the magnitude of his mistake. CEO. He finally managed to whisper the word coming out like a confession of guilt, and his eyes darted from Zara's face to her torn passport to the crowd of witnesses who were now staring at him with the kind of fascinated horror that people usually reserved for natural disasters and public executions. One of the airport police officers, Sergeant Martinez, stepped forward with handcuffs already visible on his belt, his expression professional but unmistakably satisfied as he prepared to arrest someone who had clearly abused his authority in ways that crossed every line of acceptable behavior. "Trevor Hawkins," he said in the formal tone reserved for official law enforcement actions, "you are under arrest for destruction of federal property and civil rights violations, and you have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Hawkins's wrists, Zara picked up the torn pieces of her passport with movements that were deliberate and dignified, and she looked directly into the eyes of the man who had thought he could humiliate her with impunity, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had just demonstrated exactly what happened when people mistook kindness for weakness and position for power. 3 hours later, equipped with emergency travel documents that had been expedited through diplomatic channels faster than most people could get a pizza delivered, Zara walked down the jet bridge toward SkyBridge. Flight 447. With the measured pace of someone who was about to conduct the most important performance review of her career, because while Trevor Hawkins had been the most obvious problem in her customer experience journey, she had a growing suspicion that the rot in her company extended far beyond a single rogue TSA agent with authority issues and poor judgment. The Boeing 777 stretched before her like a metallic cathedral, its first-class cabin appointed with the kind of luxury that was supposed to justify the astronomical ticket prices that passengers paid for the privilege of traveling in comfort. But as she approached the aircraft door where the cabin crew waited with their practiced smiles and choreographed welcome routines, she could already sense the subtle undercurrents of judgment and assumption that had become embedded in the culture of premium air travel. Diana Cole stood at the entrance with the posture of someone who had been performing customer service theater for nearly 2 decades, her uniform immaculate and her smile bright enough to power the aircraft's interior lighting. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at Zara that suggested the same kind of prejudgment that had led to the disaster at the security checkpoint. At 38, Cole had worked her way up to senior flight attendant through a combination of competence and politics, and she had developed the kind of finely tuned sense for passenger hierarchies that allowed her to calibrate her service level based on assumptions about who deserved priority treatment. "Boarding pass, please," Cole said with the kind of professional courtesy that managed to sound both welcoming and slightly condescending. And when she saw the first-class designation on Zara's ticket, her eyebrows rose with just enough surprise to make it clear that someone dressed in a faded hoodie wasn't what she expected to see in the premium cabin. As Zara made her way to seat 2A, she could feel the eyes of the other first-class passengers tracking her movement with the kind of curious hostility that suggested they too were making judgments about whether she belonged in their exclusive space. And she settled into her leather seat with the growing realization that the problems she had come to investigate extended far beyond ground operations into the heart of her airline's customer service culture. The first-class cabin was undeniably beautiful, with its warm lighting and carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity. But as Zara observed the interaction between crew members and passengers, she began to understand why customer satisfaction scores had been declining even among travelers who were paying premium prices for supposedly premium service. The crew moved through their routines with mechanical precision, but their warmth and attention seemed to be rationed based on assumptions about passenger status that went far beyond official frequent flyer rankings. She watched Diana Cole fawn over Mr. Caldwell in seat 3A. A man whose expensive suit and obvious comfort with first-class amenities had immediately marked him as someone worthy of extra attention, while virtually ignoring Mrs. Patterson in seat 1F, an elderly woman whose modest dress and nervous demeanor had apparently placed her in the category of passengers who were tolerated rather than celebrated. The differential treatment was subtle but unmistakable, delivered through micro-expressions and body language that spoke volumes about the underlying attitudes that shaped customer interactions. When Cole finally approached her seat, the contrast in service style was so dramatic that it might have been part of a training video about what not to do in customer service situations, because instead of the warm efficiency that other passengers received, Zara was treated to a performance of barely concealed irritation wrapped in the thinnest veneer of professional obligation. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Cole asked, her tone suggesting that any request would be an imposition on her valuable time, and when Zara politely asked for sparkling water, the flight attendant's sigh was audible enough to draw looks from nearby passengers who were beginning to sense that something unusual was happening in their exclusive environment. What she discovered over the next few hours of careful observation was a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond simple rudeness into territory that bordered on discriminatory treatment, based on assumptions about passenger worthiness that had nothing to do with actual service standards or company policies. Cole and her fellow crew members had developed an elaborate hierarchy of attention that prioritized passengers based on appearance, perceived wealth, and subjective judgments about who deserved their best efforts, and they delivered this differential treatment with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they had never been challenged or held accountable for their choices. The real revelation came when Zara witnessed Cole's interaction with the duty-free cart, because what she saw was not just poor customer service but actual criminal behavior disguised as routine operations. And she realized that her airline had been harboring employees who saw their positions not as opportunities to serve customers, but as platforms for personal enrichment at company expense. As the flight progressed and the crew's true character became increasingly apparent, Zara found herself documenting a pattern of corruption and discrimination that went far beyond anything she had imagined when she started this undercover investigation, and she began to understand that fixing SkyBridge Airlines was going to require much more than policy changes and training programs. It was going to demand a complete cultural transformation that started with removing the people who had turned customer service into an opportunity for abuse and theft. As Flight 447 cruised through the darkness above the Atlantic Ocean, 38,000 feet above a world where normal rules applied and accountability mattered, Zara Williams discovered that her airline had become something far worse than simply inefficient or poorly managed. It had evolved into an elaborate ecosystem of corruption that touched every level of operations, from baggage handling to executive suites, and the crew members she was observing were just the visible symptoms of a disease that had been eating away at her company's integrity for years. The duty-free theft operation that Diana Cole was running was so brazen and well-organized that it clearly wasn't the spontaneous crime of opportunity that Zara had initially assumed, but rather a carefully orchestrated scheme that involved multiple crew members and had probably been generating thousands of dollars in stolen revenue over months or even years of systematic fraud. She watched Cole hand Mr. Caldwell a heavy bag containing premium liquor that had never been run through the official sales system, accepting a thick envelope of cash in return, while her colleague Marcus Webb kept watch for any passengers or supervisors who might witness the transaction. What made the theft even more disturbing was the casual efficiency with which it was conducted, suggesting that this was standard operating procedure rather than unusual criminal behavior. And Zara realized that her aircraft had essentially become a flying black market, where employees felt comfortable stealing company property because they had never faced consequences for their actions. The inventory control systems that should have prevented this kind of theft had clearly been compromised or ignored, and the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to protect company assets had failed so completely that criminal behavior had become normalized as just another perk of employment. But the financial crimes were only part of the problem, because as Zara continued to observe crew interactions with passengers, she began to document a pattern of discriminatory treatment that was so institutionalized it might as well have been printed in the employee manual as official policy. Cole and her team operated with a sophisticated understanding of passenger profiling that allowed them to provide excellent service to some travelers, while systematically neglecting or mistreating others based on criteria that had nothing to do with legitimate customer service standards. She watched them lavish attention on passengers who fit their mental image of first-class worthiness, while treating others with levels of indifference or hostility that bordered on harassment, and the consistency of their behavior suggested that this wasn't individual prejudice, but rather a cultural norm that had been reinforced through years of practice and management tolerance. The crew moved through the cabin like social anthropologists conducting field research, making instant judgments about passenger status and adjusting their service accordingly, and their ability to switch between warmth and coldness depending on who they were serving was so seamless that it clearly represented learned professional behavior rather than spontaneous personal choice. The worst incident occurred when an elderly passenger in economy class, a frail woman who was traveling alone to visit her grandchildren, rang her call button, requesting assistance with reaching her medication in the overhead compartment, and Zara watched through the crack in the curtain as Cole responded with such callous indifference that it made her stomach turn with rage and professional embarrassment. Instead of helping the woman reach her prescription medication, Cole lectured her about proper travel preparation and suggested that people who couldn't manage their own basic needs should consider staying home rather than bothering flight crews with personal problems. The interaction was captured on Zara's phone camera through the gap in the curtains, and as she watched the elderly woman's face crumple with humiliation. While other passengers pretended not to notice her distress, she felt a kind of white-hot fury building in her chest that had nothing to do with business metrics or customer satisfaction scores, and everything to do with basic human decency and the fundamental responsibility that came with wearing a SkyBridge uniform. What truly horrified her was the realization that this behavior wasn't aberrant, but rather representative of company culture that had been allowed to develop unchecked for years, while executives focused on financial performance and market share, rather than the basic question of whether their employees were treating customers with the respect that every human being deserved regardless of their economic status or personal appearance. The crew operated with the confidence of people who had never been held accountable for their choices, and their casual cruelty suggested institutional problems that went far beyond individual character flaws. When Cole deliberately spilled tomato juice on her during what was supposedly routine beverage service, creating a mess that stained her clothes and ruined her laptop while making it appear accidental to other passengers, Zara understood that she was witnessing the kind of calculated malice that could only flourish in an environment where abuse of power was tolerated or even encouraged by management systems that prioritized employee convenience over customer dignity. The assault was so carefully orchestrated that it would have been impossible to prove as intentional misconduct to anyone who hadn't been specifically watching for signs of discriminatory behavior, and Cole's immediate accusations of intoxication and disruptive conduct were delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who had used similar tactics before to discredit passengers who complained about poor treatment. The psychological manipulation was expertly crafted to isolate Zara from potential supporters among other passengers, while providing Cole with plausible deniability if the incident ever became subject to official investigation. As the flight continued its journey across the ocean toward what would become a reckoning that would transform SkyBridge Airlines forever, Zara sat in her stained clothes, documenting every detail of what she had witnessed, and she began to understand that the problems she had uncovered weren't going to be solved through conventional management approaches, but would instead require the kind of comprehensive cultural transformation that could only be achieved by removing everyone who had been complicit in creating and maintaining an environment where corruption and discrimination had become accepted parts of daily operations. The descent into Heathrow Airport felt like preparing for battle, because as the wheels of Flight 447 touched down on the rain-slicked runway in the gray London morning, Zara Williams knew that she was about to orchestrate the kind of corporate reckoning that would send shockwaves through the aviation industry and demonstrate to her employees, her board of directors, and the traveling public that the culture of corruption and discrimination she had witnessed was about to end with the finality of a guillotine blade. She had spent the final 2 hours of the flight documenting every detail of what she had observed and experienced, creating a comprehensive record of criminal behavior and discriminatory treatment that would serve as evidence in the legal proceedings that were already being prepared by her legal team back in Dallas. And as the aircraft taxied toward the gate, she could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a cloak made of steel and righteous anger. Diana Cole moved through the cabin with the satisfied demeanor of someone who believed she had successfully put an unworthy passenger in her place. Her interactions with other crew members marked by the kind of whispered commentary and shared glances that suggested they were all congratulating themselves on a job well done, and their complete lack of awareness about what was waiting for them at the gate would have been amusing if their crimes hadn't been so serious and their victims so numerous. The announcement that police were boarding the aircraft to remove a disruptive passenger was delivered with Cole's characteristic blend of professional authority and personal satisfaction, and she clearly expected to watch Zara being led away in handcuffs, while other passengers nodded approvingly at the efficient removal of someone who had obviously been causing problems throughout the flight. What she didn't expect was to see Elena Rostova, SkyBridge's Vice President of European Operations, standing on the jet bridge flanked by 4 armed British police officers and holding a tablet that contained termination paperwork that had been prepared with the kind of thoroughness that came from having unlimited corporate resources and unlimited corporate fury. The moment when Cole's triumphant expression collapsed into confused terror as the police officers walked directly past her and stopped in front of Zara with respectful salutes would become legend among SkyBridge employees within hours, because the image of a supposedly disruptive passenger being treated like visiting royalty, while the crew member who had reported her was left standing there with her mouth hanging open, perfectly captured the kind of power reversal that corporate nightmares were made of. Ms. Williams, Sergeant Harrison of the Metropolitan Police said with the kind of formal courtesy that was reserved for diplomats and heads of state, "We've received your report regarding theft and assault, and we're prepared to take the individuals responsible into custody." His words hung in the cabin air like the smoke from a bombed building, and as their implications settled over the crew members who had participated in what they thought was consequence-free criminal behavior, the atmosphere shifted from satisfied triumph to absolute panic. Elena Rostova stepped forward with the tablet containing legal documents that would end multiple careers simultaneously, her expression carrying the kind of cold professional fury that came from discovering that employees she had trusted had been systematically destroying her company's reputation while stealing from both the corporation and its customers. "Diana Cole," she said, her voice carrying the weight of corporate judgment, "you are terminated immediately for theft, fraud, and discriminatory conduct, and you will be arrested for criminal behavior that violates both British law and federal aviation regulations." The transformation of Cole from confident authority figure to panicking criminal defendant happened so quickly that passengers later described it as watching someone's entire world collapse in real time, and her desperate attempts to claim innocence and shift blame to other crew members only served to provide additional evidence of guilt while demonstrating exactly the kind of character that had made her termination not just justified but morally imperative. As the police led Cole and Marcus Webb away in handcuffs, their protests echoing through the jet bridge like the death throes of a corrupt culture that had finally been held accountable for its crimes. Zara stood in the aircraft doorway wearing her stained hoodie and carrying her damaged laptop, and she looked back at the cabin that had been the scene of so much criminal behavior and discriminatory treatment with the satisfaction of someone who had just proven that power without accountability was an illusion that could be shattered by anyone with enough courage to demand justice. The image of the young woman in casual clothes watching police arrest uniformed airline employees would become the defining symbol of corporate transformation because it perfectly captured the moment when appearance-based assumptions about authority and worthiness were revealed to be not just wrong, but catastrophically dangerous for anyone who built their career on the foundation of those assumptions. 3 weeks after Diana Cole and Marcus Webb were led away in handcuffs from a rain-soaked jet bridge at Heathrow Airport, Zara Williams sat in a wood-paneled hearing room in the Rayburn House office building facing a semicircle of congresspeople who had convened an emergency session of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to investigate what media outlets were calling the most significant civil rights scandal in modern aviation history. And as she adjusted the microphone in front of her, she knew that her testimony would either launch a new era of accountability in commercial air travel or disappear into the bureaucratic machinery that had allowed discrimination to flourish for decades. The viral video of Trevor Hawkins destroying her passport had been viewed over 40 million times across all platforms, spawning hashtags like #JusticeForZara and #AirportDiscrimination that had transformed her personal humiliation into a national conversation about power privilege and the casual cruelty that had become normalized in transportation security, and the public pressure generated by that conversation had forced Congress to act with a speed that surprised even the most cynical observers of federal politics. Chairwoman Patricia Rodriguez of Texas opened the hearing with remarks that acknowledged the gravity of what had transpired while carefully avoiding any commitment to specific legislative remedies. But the bipartisan nature of the outrage that had brought them together suggested that meaningful reform might actually be possible if the testimony provided sufficient evidence of problems that extended beyond individual bad actors into broader cultural failures. Mrs. Williams, Chairwoman Rodriguez, began, her voice carrying the weight of formal congressional authority. Thank you for agreeing to share your experience with this committee, and please know that we understand the personal cost of the decision to speak publicly about what happened to you. The acknowledgement felt both genuine and political, but Zara had spent enough time navigating complex power structures to understand that sincerity and calculation weren't mutually exclusive in environments where public perception mattered as much as actual policy outcomes. Zara's testimony was delivered with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through hostile board meetings and skeptical investor presentations. But underneath the corporate polish was a current of personal pain that made her words resonate with emotional authenticity that cut through the usual congressional theater to reach something deeper and more powerful than political positioning. She described not just what had happened to her, but what she had witnessed happening to other passengers, and her account painted a picture of widespread abuse that had been systematized and normalized through years of institutional indifference. The elderly woman who couldn't reach her medication, Zara said, her voice steady, but carrying undertones of controlled anger. The young mother who was humiliated for her child's crying, the teenager who was searched because of his appearance. These weren't isolated incidents, but examples of how discrimination had become embedded in the daily operations of transportation systems that are supposed to serve all Americans equally. Her words were carefully chosen to emphasize the breadth of the problem, while avoiding inflammatory language that might undermine her credibility with conservative committee members. Representative James Mitchell of Oklahoma, known for his skepticism toward civil rights legislation, attempted to redirect the hearing toward questions about security protocols and the challenges faced by transportation workers, but his efforts to minimize the significance of what had occurred were undermined by video evidence that had already been seen by millions of Americans who understood exactly what they were watching when they saw authority being abused for personal satisfaction rather than legitimate security purposes. The most powerful moment of Zara's testimony came when she read excerpts from letters she had received from other passengers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the resources or platform to seek accountability. And as she shared their stories of humiliation and discrimination, the hearing room fell silent with the kind of attention that suggested even the most politically calculating members of the committee understood they were witnessing something that transcended normal partisan boundaries. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a civil rights expert from Georgetown University, who testified after Zara provided historical context that connected her experience to longer patterns of discriminatory enforcement that had characterized American transportation since the era of segregation, and his academic analysis helped committee members understand that what they were investigating wasn't just individual misconduct, but the persistence of cultural attitudes that had never been fully addressed or corrected. When Representative Sarah Chen of California asked Zara what specific legislative changes she would recommend, her response demonstrated the kind of practical leadership that had made her successful in corporate environments while addressing the broader social implications of transportation discrimination. We need oversight mechanisms that include regular auditing of passenger treatment data, mandatory bias, training for all customer-facing employees, and federal funding tied to measurable improvements in service equity, she said, offering concrete solutions rather than merely documenting problems. The hearing concluded with testimony from Trevor Hawkins himself, who appeared in his federal prison uniform to offer what his attorney described as remorse for his actions. But his words rang hollow against the documented evidence of his pattern of abusive behavior, and his presence served mainly to illustrate the personal consequences that could follow from the kind of unchecked power that had characterized too many transportation security interactions. As Zara walked out of the hearing room surrounded by reporters and advocacy group representatives who wanted to continue the conversation about aviation reform, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope that reflected both the personal cost of becoming the face of a national movement and the possibility that her experience might actually lead to changes that would protect other travelers from the kind of treatment she had endured. The transformation of SkyBridge Airlines from a company that tolerated discrimination and theft into an industry leader in customer service excellence happened with the kind of systematic thoroughness that could only be achieved when unlimited corporate resources were directed by unlimited determination to change fundamental organizational culture. And within 6 months of Zara's congressional testimony, every aspect of airline operations had been restructured around principles of dignity, respect, and accountability that were enforced through mechanisms designed to make backsliding impossible. The Dignity First initiative that Zara launched immediately upon her return from London wasn't just another corporate diversity program with impressive-sounding goals and minimal enforcement mechanisms, but rather a comprehensive overhaul of hiring practices, training procedures, performance evaluation criteria, and disciplinary protocols that made respectful treatment of all passengers a non-negotiable condition of employment rather than an aspirational ideal that could be ignored when convenient. Every SkyBridge employee, from baggage handlers to senior executives, was required to complete 40 hours of intensive bias awareness training that was developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and delivered by facilitators who understood that changing behavior required more than just information transfer, but actual psychological work to identify and challenge unconscious assumptions about who deserved respect and courtesy. Riley Chen, the young TS, an agent whose moral courage had led her to provide testimony about Trevor Hawkins' pattern of discriminatory behavior, was recruited by SkyBridge to head their new passenger advocacy department, a position that gave her authority to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, and ensure that the company's commitment to equal treatment was backed up by real enforcement mechanisms rather than empty corporate rhetoric. The promotion of Riley from federal security work to airline management sent a clear message throughout the industry that standing up for passenger rights was not only safe, but actually career-enhancing, and her success in building accountability systems became a model that other carriers began to adopt as they faced increasing public scrutiny of their own customer service practices. The financial impact of SkyBridge's transformation was immediate and dramatic, with customer satisfaction scores rising to industry-leading levels within 3 months as word spread through social media and travel communities that the airline had become a place where passengers could expect to be treated with consistent respect regardless of their appearance, economic status, or personal characteristics that had previously triggered discriminatory treatment. Revenue increased by 37% in the first quarter after the policy changes were implemented, as travelers who had avoided SkyBridge due to its reputation for poor service began choosing the carrier specifically because of its commitment to equal treatment, and the company's stock price reached historic highs as investors recognized that treating customers well wasn't just morally correct, but financially profitable in ways that sustainable competitive advantage. The employee response to the cultural transformation was initially mixed with some long-term staff members, resenting the additional training requirements and oversight mechanisms. But the systematic removal of workers who couldn't adapt to expectations of respectful behavior created space for new hires who embraced the company's values, and within a year the workforce had been essentially rebuilt around people who understood that customer service was a privilege rather than a burden. Diana Cole and Marcus Webb, serving concurrent sentences in federal prison for theft and fraud, became cautionary tales that were referenced in training materials across the aviation industry, their mugshots serving as reminders of what happened when employees confused their temporary authority for permanent license to abuse customers who couldn't immediately fight back. The legal settlements that SkyBridge reached with passengers who had experienced discriminatory treatment during Cole's tenure as senior flight attendant totaled over $12 million. But more importantly, the company's willingness to acknowledge past wrongs and compensate victims demonstrated a level of corporate accountability that had been rare in the airline industry and helped establish trust with communities that had historically been underserved by commercial aviation. Zara's leadership during the transformation process was characterized by the same hands-on approach that had led to her undercover investigation with regular unannounced flights on SkyBridge aircraft to monitor service quality and employee behavior, and her continued willingness to experience her company's operations from the customer perspective ensured that the cultural changes were maintained rather than allowed to deteriorate once media attention moved to other issues. The ripple effects of SkyBridge's transformation extended far beyond a single company as competitor airlines faced increasing pressure from customers, employees, and shareholders to demonstrate their own commitment to equal treatment, and the SkyBridge standard became a benchmark that was referenced in industry publications, regulatory discussions, and business school case studies as an example of how leadership courage could create both social value and financial success. Riley Chen's success in building passenger advocacy systems at SkyBridge led to her recognition as one of the aviation industry's most innovative young leaders, and her work became the foundation for federal regulations that required all airlines to establish similar oversight mechanisms, ensuring that the principles of accountability and respect would spread throughout commercial aviation, rather than remaining isolated achievements at a single carrier. 2 years after Trevor Hawkins had torn Zara Williams' passport in half at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, the aviation industry bore little resemblance to the culture of casual discrimination and unchecked authority that had characterized commercial air travel for decades, because the changes that began with one woman's decision to experience her own company's operations had spread through the entire transportation sector, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, touching every aspect of how passengers were treated and employees were trained. The Trevor Hawkins case, as it came to be known in law enforcement and legal education circles, had resulted in the strongest federal civil rights conviction related to transportation discrimination since the landmark cases of the 1960s. And his 18-month prison sentence served as a deterrent that fundamentally altered how security personnel across the country approached their interactions with travelers, because the possibility of serious personal consequences had replaced the previous assumption that abuse of authority would be tolerated or ignored. Hawkins himself, upon his release from federal prison, had undergone what could only be described as a complete personal transformation, partly due to mandatory counseling programs, but mostly due to the humbling experience of learning what it felt like to be powerless in the face of institutional authority, and his work at a community center helping formerly incarcerated individuals navigate re-entry challenges represented a kind of redemption that surprised even those who had advocated for restorative rather than purely punitive justice approaches. Riley Chen's rise from conflicted TSA agent to Director of Passenger Experience Innovation at the Department of Transportation had been meteoric even by Washington standards, and her development of national training protocols that were now mandatory for all transportation security personnel had created the kind of cultural shift that policy experts had thought impossible to achieve through federal intervention. The training programs that Riley designed were based on the radical premise that security work was fundamentally about protection rather than control, and that effective threat detection was actually enhanced when passengers felt respected rather than intimidated, because people who trusted security personnel were more likely to report suspicious behavior and less likely to engage in the kind of confrontational interactions that distracted from legitimate security concerns. Diana Cole and Marcus Webb had served their sentences and disappeared into obscurity, their names mentioned only in training materials as examples of how criminal behavior disguised as customer service could destroy both individual careers and corporate reputations. But their legacy lived on in the comprehensive oversight systems that made it virtually impossible for similar corruption to flourish undetected in modern airline operations. The congressional legislation that emerged from Zara's testimony, known as the Passenger Dignity Act, had been signed into law with bipartisan support that reflected the rare political alignment that occurred when public outrage was both sustained and focused on issues that transcended partisan divisions, and its requirements for transparency, accountability, and equal treatment had been adopted not just by airlines but by other service industries that recognized the business value of treating customers with consistent respect. SkyBridge Airlines had become the most profitable carrier in the United States, its success demonstrating that the false choice between financial performance and ethical behavior had always been a management failure rather than an economic necessity. And business schools now taught the SkyBridge model as an example of how authentic cultural transformation could create sustainable competitive advantages that couldn't be copied by competitors who were unwilling to make similar commitments to operational integrity. Zara Williams kept the torn pieces of her original passport framed in her office, not as a reminder of personal victimization, but as evidence that dignity could survive attempts to destroy it, and that individual courage could catalyze changes that extended far beyond personal circumstances to touch the lives of millions of people who would never know her name but would benefit from her decision to demand accountability from systems that had operated without oversight for too long. The young women of color who now filled aviation management training programs across the country often cited Zara's example as inspiration for their own career choices. But what they learned from her story wasn't just that barriers could be broken, but that breaking barriers was meaningless, unless the systems behind those barriers were rebuilt to serve everyone with equal dignity, because true leadership wasn't about achieving personal success, but about using that success to create opportunities for others to thrive in environments defined by respect rather than prejudice. The final measurement of Zara's impact could be found not in corporate profits or congressional legislation, but in the countless small interactions that happened every day in airports across America, where security personnel and airline employees now approached their work with the understanding that every passenger deserved to be treated as if their dignity mattered, because that simple principle had become the foundation of an industry that had finally learned to value humanity alongside efficiency. Zara keeps the torn passport framed in her office as a reminder that dignity cannot be destroyed by hatred, no matter how much authority backs up that hatred. SkyBridge became the most trusted airline in America, proving that treating people with respect isn't just morally right. It's the foundation of sustainable business success. When other executives ask her secret, she tells them there is no secret. Only the decision to see every customer as someone's mother, father, child, or friend who deserves to come home safely and with their humanity intact. Trevor Hawkins serves his time quietly and works at a re-entry center upon release, slowly learning that true authority comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Riley Chen becomes the youngest director in Transportation Security Administration history, revolutionizing how security personnel are trained to see protection as partnership, rather than domination. Her programs spread globally, proving that change is possible when people choose courage over comfort. Zara's story becomes required reading in business schools not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that change is possible when leaders have the courage to experience the world through others' eyes. The girl in the hoodie didn't just transform an airline, she reminded an entire industry that behind every passenger is a human being whose dignity matters more than any uniform badge or assumption about where they belong in the world. If this story of justice and transformation moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about how we can all contribute to creating more respectful communities. Together, we can ensure that dignity isn't a privilege reserved for the few, but a right that belongs to everyone.